Hello, and welcome to the demo for the Watercolor Line and Wash for the Fruit Fusion project. To get started, you will need a piece of watercolor paper. You will need a pencil for sketching and an eraser. You will need at least one watercolor paintbrush, a ruler for a straight edge, a variety of fine liners of different widths, and if you happen to have it, a dip pen and black Indian ink. We will also need watercolor paint. You can use the lid to mix your paints, or you can grab a separate palette for mixing paints. In addition, you'll also need a cup of water, a paper towel, and possibly a piece of scratch paper to test out any watercolors and pen techniques. We will be using this reference image here. To get started, we are going to do a light sketch. Remember to think about your composition. Draw large to fill the paper. Remember to take your time and really look at that reference image, drawing what you see and not what you know. If you mess up, just erase. Get the entire contour, including the stem. Erase any extra lines to get a nice clean edge. And remember to look at your reference image. You may have to adjust your drawing as you go. And don't forget to sketch in that cast shadow. Once you are happy with your drawing, go ahead and erase any extra pencil lines. Now that my sketch is done, my next step is to draw in that rectangle shape. For this project, our goal is to have our drawing go beyond the rectangle. And don't forget to avoid those tangents. One way to avoid tangents is to start with guideline marks like I am doing so here. This gives me a good idea of where my lines are going to be before I draw them out. And once you're happy, go ahead and draw those lines. Struggle to get that rectangle perfect, making sure the horizontal lines are parallel and the vertical lines are parallel. Make sure your paper is nice and clean. Everything is where you want it to be. And now we are ready for some watercolor. Now remember, with watercolor, we need to be patient so that things don't bleed into each other that we don't want to bleed into each other. I am going to start with my background wash. I'm going to take that water outside the rectangle, and I'm going to keep a nice clean edge around the pear. Now that I have water down in all the areas that I want the paint to go, I'm ready to start to add some color. I'm going to go ahead and move some colors around my paper, getting a nice clean edge against that pear. I am working wet into wet, and I'm going to go ahead and grab some other colors to add in. The paint is going to go anywhere I added water. I can move the paint around with my brush. I can also lighten up the paint by adding more water to it. I'm going to keep this fairly light because I'm going to eventually add some pen on top of this. While it's still wet, feel free to pick it up and move it around to kind of have more control of where that color goes. If you like how this looks, go ahead and let it dry. If you don't like the way it looks, feel free to add more color. Now we are ready to start with the first layer of our pear. Once again, we're going to start with a wash. I'm going to lay down water only in the areas I want the paint to go. So right now it's just going to be in the pear. While my paper is still wet, I'm first going to lay in that base color. Remember to look at your reference image. Take note that the light is coming from the left side, so the right side of the pear appears a little darker. While the yellow is still wet and my paper is still wet, I'm going to add in some more colors. This is called wet into wet. And don't forget that watercolor is very forgiving. If you make a mistake, you can quickly dab it up with a paper towel. Remember, this is just our first layer, so we can go in and get darker later. And don't forget, you could pick up your paper and move the paint around. And once you're happy, let that dry. Now we are ready for our next layer. So we're going to go ahead and layer in our values. This time I'm not going to start with water. I am going to draw in the shapes with my paintbrush. I am continuously looking at my reference image and changing up my colors as I go. And it's okay if you mess up. We are going to add some more layers on top of this, and in the end we're going over this with pen. While the paint is wet, I will be softening up the edges. I can do this by adding some more water to my brush and moving the paint around, or I can add additional colors. Here you will see me do a little bit of both. I am continually adding in more layers. I am darkening up the lights so that I can darken up the darks. I'm still looking at my image and I'm noticing on the right side there's a little bit of reflective light, so I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of yellow right there. And now my darks need to go a little darker. There's a few spots of reddish brown colors. I've added them in, but they have faded, so now I need to brighten them back up. And remember, you have control of where this is going to go, so I can tilt it, I can move it however I'd like. And since this is still wet, I see a few lines up at the top here, so I'm going ahead and take my brush and pull it down to create some of those textures. I also see that there's a few spots on the pear, so I can do a splattering technique to give some of those textures to the pear. It's okay that it goes beyond the pear because that kind of adds to it, but if you don't like it, blotch it up with a paper towel. Keep in mind that my pear is still wet, so those splatters that I've added to my pear will now bleed out. Looking back at my image, I'm noticing that there's a few light spots on my pear that I need to lighten up, so I'm going to pull them back with my paper towel before the paint dries. And I've lost my reflective light right there, so I'm going to go ahead and pull up the right side of the pear as well. Let the pear dry, and we can go back in and add another layer of paint. Watercolor tends to look a little lighter once it's dry, so it's important to go back in and add those darks. Again, I'm going straight in with paint to draw with the paint. My goal here is to create a little bit of contrast. Value creates the edges of forms. To do that, we put a light next to a dark. Again, I keep looking at my reference image to know where to go light and where to go dark. I'll need to add in my core shadow in order to give this more of a three-dimensional feel. You'll see me working a little bit of everywhere. Something is light because it's next to something that is dark, and something is dark because it's next to something that is light. This is why it is important to work everywhere, because your colors will change as you put more colors down. Now that I've added in some darks, notice how my lights have kind of faded. I can now go in and add some brighter yellows to this. And my initial splattering has faded, so I'm going to go ahead and add some more, this time adding additional spots to the outside of the pear. Let's let this dry before we move on. All right, we're going to go ahead and start on the stem here. Once again, I'm going to draw with the paint. Notice how the top of the pear is the darkest part on my pear. So not only will I darken up the top of the stem, but also darken up around the stem. Moving on to the cast shadow, I'm mixing up some cooler hues to put down. We want to keep a nice clean edge right next to the pear. Notice how the darkest part of the cast shadow is right next to the pear. Have fun with some wet into wet, and remember that this cast shadow can go beyond the rectangle. And remember, you can control where the water and the paint goes. Let's just add a little more dark right around here. Again, we are doing wet into wet, and the paint's going to bleed. I can move it around with my brush. I can even pick up my paper and move it around that way. I can even add a little bit of water to soften my edge. And once you're happy with it, let's give it some time to dry. And guess what? We are going to add more darks. Make sure to take a break and step away from your artwork. Come back to it with fresh eyes. Look at your reference image. Make sure everything that you need is there, and let it dry. Now that we're done with watercolor, we're ready to move on to the fine liner. Here I'm going to start with a micron pen. You can use any type of pen you'd like. Try using a variety of different pens to get a variety of different line widths. Start by outlining your rectangle. Use a straight edge to keep it nice and straight. The pear goes in front of the rectangle, so remember to skip over it when creating your lines. Instead of turning your ruler, turn your paper. It makes it so much easier. Once you have your rectangle traced in pen, you are ready to start your vertical lines. Take your time with this. We need to make sure that these lines are straight and that they are parallel. We also want to make sure that we're not going to smudge our lines with our ruler. It would be a good idea to practice this before you do this on your project. Feel free to switch your pen for a different line width. Again, these lines go behind the pear. Take your time. And look at that, this is starting to look like a book illustration. It's beautiful. All that is left is to add some line work to the pear. Feel free to add lines with the fine liner or use a dip pen with India ink. Now, dip pens can be a little messy, so make sure that you practice before applying it to your artwork. Start by outlining the pear. With a dip pen, you can play with the pressure to get different line widths. If you're using a dip pen, be very careful so that the ink does not smudge. Remember to add in those pen techniques that we learned: hatching, curved lines, cross hatching, and a variety of line widths. Adding some hatching lines to the dark area of the pear will help it feel even more three-dimensional. Let's add a few lines to the cast shadow. And let's make that texture pop. And just like that, we are done. Let us know how you did in the comments below. Thank you for watching.